Okay, welcome back. Let's talk a little bit more about Muslim art and these different parts of the Muslim world. So where do you tend to see Muslim art? You tend to see it in mosques. And I think that video is a little bit older. So we should be quick to note that art isn't always in a religious context. It can be in a secular context too. It's just that the way that this art is done is very influenced by the religious norms of the society. So for instance, religion inspires people to make a beautiful art without a visual depiction of animals or humans. And then from there, later on, you can be an expert calligrapher and artist in a sort of non religious context as well, just trying to create things of beauty. But the place where we see the most arabesques in calligraphy is probably the mosque. So the mosques, I think I pointed this out previously, but one of the distinctive things about a mosque is the minaret or minarets. Any kind of tower where you can call people to prayer. A part of Islam is praying at set times a day, 5 times a day, and prayer brings people together. So either you pray yourself at the time when everybody else is calling out the prayers, or you go and are summoned to the mosque to pray. So you see the styles of those towers. Now, again, with the theme that the Greek world is and the Turkish world were influenced by each other, this is the Blue Mosque in Constantinople, or should I say Istanbul. Today it's known as Istanbul, but the related words, the stan, is common to both of them. It just kind of morphs over time as different languages are spoken. But in Istanbul, they have the Blue Mosque basically right across the way from the Hagia Sophia. And the Hagia Sophia is a very similar design here. It has the big dome and the sort of lesser half domes coming off of it. In the Turkish times, they added on minarets to the Hagia Sophia, and so it resembled something more like this. But then the Blue Mosque was built in the time of Suleiman, and really built to match the splendor of the Hagia Sophia. So learning from what had previously been done in that city and kind of honoring that legacy and reproducing that legacy. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so the sort of final story of the Ottomans is, like I said, they go into decline in the 1900s, and after World War I are broken apart. But there emerges an interesting sort of movement in the region that we now call Turkey, which is basically Turkish independence from being conquered by Europeans and not being able to control their destiny. They managed to rally and establish a country around Turkey, around that peninsula. And it has a lot to do with a guy named Ataturk, who is sort of a national leader and national hero to Turkish identity, establishing this new nation that was going to be basically the core of what had been the Ottoman Empire. And interestingly, they retained Istanbul, even though it had been more on the Greek part of the peninsula. So in a way, the current country of Turkey straddles what's thought of as Europe and what's thought of as Asia or the Middle East. But that's just basically a little epilogue there. But Turkey very much has its own distinct culture, and part of that is the Ottoman legacy. But a lot of other regions were also ruled by the Ottomans, and they split off, and now they have their own sort of cultural identities, in part through their own sort of cultural practices, in part because of the way they were divided by Europeans. If we look at the art of the Safavids, we see some similar use of arabesques, although they're different styles. And if you pay enough attention, you can sort of note the subtle differences there. This one seems like more of a Persian style with the use of blue and gold in these specific shapes and patterns. And then over here, you see that actually sometimes animals are being depicted, but in this case, animals are being depicted, but humans are not. And like I say, Persian culture has its own distinct set of ideas around Islam and the Shia Muslim tradition. And we talked previously about the Mughal Empire. One of the interesting things about their art is that they become much more representational, and they're willing to have human beings in their art, if not depictions of Muhammad necessarily, then depictions of just humans in general, sure. They can do that. Um, and I think part of that has to do with the legacy of India, where images are so important. Images, making images of the gods is such a constant thing. The Mughal conquerors, they adapt, they, incorporate some of those ideas into their own conquest, which is like a classic question in studies of history, is how much do the conquerors change the conquered and how much does it go the other way around. And we talked previously about the Taj Mahal, the sort of very notable building of Muslim India under the Mughal Empire. This sort of fabulous mausoleum that the Mughal king made for his deceased wife. You can maybe see the influence of domes and minarets. There's that domes maybe influenced by the Christian world, and the minarets definitely influenced by Muslim mosques. Okay, so now what I want to do is switch gears and start talking about the Mongols. So the Mughals and the Mongols might be a little bit related, but it's usually useful to keep them distinct. So you may or may not have heard of the Mongols, but we're going to jump back in time, and you may have not heard of the Mongols, but you've probably heard of Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan was the great Khan, the Khan who had conquered all the way to the ocean. It's a title of his, meaning something like the ocean conqueror. And he was a leader of a group of sort of loosely affiliated horsemen in Mongolia. And Mongolia is up here to the north of China. And a lot of times these would be the people who China thought as barbarians, that the Chinese dynasty tried to keep from outside of their walls, building the Great Wall to keep sort of the people up here from invading them too often. And they had a tendency to see them as sort of barbaric or as dirty in various ways, not civilized, not cultured. And the Mongols are really fascinating in a lot of ways because they are one of the great success stories of history, the great success stories for people who are not living in cities so much, really. It's very rare that we come across a culture that isn't inherently city dwelling, but the Mongols were always on the go. They are what's known as a nomadic culture. They raised their sheep and their goats, and they had horses, and they basically rode across the sort of open steppes, these sort of dry, low-level plants, sort of plains. This is where the Mongols lived. And they had a very big horse riding culture, and it's extremely rare in history. I think we have a lot of an idea that barbarians are overtaking great empires all the time, but it's actually extremely rare that anybody from a nomadic culture is able to successfully conquer a city dwelling culture. Sometimes they're able to disrupt them. We saw that a lot with the Romans, and sometimes they can win battles, but usually in the long term, cities have more resources. So something's kind of got to be going wrong in the city for a outside nomadic force to take it over. And by nomads, I specifically mean people who kind of travel around with herds or flocks of animals. That's one way of living if you're not in cities and growing food on farms. So the Mongols were like that. And the Mongols happened upon a very nice sort of cheat code to winning battles, which was their mastery of horseback archery. They were very good on horses. Everybody had a sort of training in horse riding, and they were one of the few cultures that really figured out how to shoot and ride at the same time. This isn't something we see in a whole lot of other cultures. They basically invented it. So this guy has a spear. He also has arrows. And so he is really able to hit and run. And that's what the Mongols could do. They could move very fast before their enemy knew what was upon them, and they could take out the armies of their opponent with ferocity and force. So they were much more flexible. And so in a way, their technology was more advanced despite their not dwelling in cities. They just happened to have a culture that really praised archery and horseback riding and developed this sort of technology of using them together. which is quite interesting. And it led to them achieving a remarkable amount of conquest. Look at how they're going here. And this is happening in the 1200s. So we're a little bit before the Ottomans are around at this point. So we've gone back a little bit to fill in, but we're going to put the whole picture together as we go here. So in the 1200s, Genghis Khan and his generals were just spreading out and taking out one city after another, after another, after another. And look how far they got. Basically, the whole of this sort of Russian Chinese plain here, the Mongolian plain, the area in between those regions here. Basically, they conquered Asia, or most of Asia anyway. Here's an early version of their empire in 1227. And here you can see they have gotten all the way up to basically the border of Persia and the border of India. And, you know, all as far as like basically Russia here, basically as far as Moscow and some part of northern China. And they're just going to keep going. Eventually, they also include Persia, and they've conquered a little speck of Europe here, and they've conquered all the way to what we think of China, the whole of China, and Korea for that matter. Japan manages to escape them, but only due to the divine wind that wrecked the Mongol ships. At that point, they had a lot more resources. But yeah, this is the Mongol Empire. So sort of the biggest, least known about empire. Um, and you know, in a way, they might be kind of the inspiration for the Dothraki in Game of Thrones. But I would argue that that kind of does them the disservice because the Dothraki, they're just wild and aggressive, and they like to kill things and smash things in a lot of ways. Whereas the Mongols actually were more chill than that. But they were very good at conquering. I think the point I want to emphasize is the Mongols had more supplies, they had more resources. They cared about things like taking enemy weapons and armor and stuff. And they always had their flocks coming along with them. So they had a system where they could kind of lead their horses out, and then there was another group of people, often the women, who were staying with the flocks and kind of guiding the flocks along. And then the horsemen could go really fast and kind of scout and then come back, or go win a battle and then come back and then, bring all the flocks in afterward. So it's interesting. But yeah, they're really worth knowing about, and they have their own very unique and distinct culture. And they could do things that nobody else could do because they had unique skill sets and technology, such as invade Russia during the winter. Nobody else has ever succeeded in doing that. But yeah, now one part of the reason I bring them up is because they are incredibly important in the history of the Middle East. They basically brought the Abbasid Caliphate to an end. So there goes the sort of golden age of Baghdad, where Baghdad is this sort of Library of Alexandria style center of knowledge and learning. That city seems to have mostly been weakened, and that was the end of that particular caliphate, which sort of paved the way later on for the Ottomans to come along. And then they conquered China as well, which is a really big deal. China has been this relatively isolated region with its own culture for such a long time. And, it would break, it would get back together, it would break, it would get back together, but it never been invaded from the outside before. And so this is kind of the end of the Tang and Song dynasties, which were kind of a golden age in China. But the interesting thing is that as destructive as the conquests were, and as intense as the battles were, the relationships between the Mongols and the people they conquered actually seemed to be pretty positive. In fact, Genghis over here, also known by his given names, Taizu or Temujin, when we're not using his title, Temujin or Genghis, he really seemed to have believed a lot in freedom of religion, and in fact sort of officially established it as a doctrine of his empire. Now, he had a lot of religion to contend with. He had Muslims in his empire, he had Confucians, he had Buddhists, he had Taoists, he had all sorts of stuff going on, and including the sort of more traditional religion, almost polytheistic Mongol religion as well. So it was a smart move. And in general, the way that the Mongols ruled is a lot more like the way that the Romans ruled, is that they would leave people alone. They wouldn't try to get them to change their religion or anything like that. They just wanted them to give them money. So you give the Mongol king who's at the top money, you can basically do what you want to do. Of course, he does get the final say on everything. So the Khan becomes the ruler of all these regions, and it seems to go pretty well in Persia and Baghdad as well. Um, but you'll notice that here the territory is divided into different colors. That's because this is the classic case of an empire that fragmented after its leader's death. Not too long after Genghis, it split into 4 khanates, and these are the different regions here. And one of them was basically the territory of Mongolia and China. But within these regions, they basically kept up their own sort of continued uh, identity. So as much as they were being ruled by Mongol outsiders, the Mongols took on the practices and the ideas of those cultures. In Iran, Hulagu Khan was the founder of the Il Khanate and basically, learned from Persian culture. Um, in China, Kublai Khan, whose name is a bit famous, he basically ran things like a Chinese emperor and established himself in Beijing in the sort of areas of Chinese power and control. And so that's going to lead us into our discussion of Yuan China. So Yuan China, however you want to pronounce it, incorporates the region of Mongolia and China here, and is one of the dynasties that are worth noting. So in the next video, I'm going to talk a bit about the different dynasties that come at this point and sort of China in general. So I'll see you in that video.